Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes of our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Today we're joined by Mary Kay Magistad, a recovering foreign journalist who has done a lot of interesting things. Mary Kay, thanks for being on Democratic Television.
It's my pleasure.
So before we talk about your travels around the world and your interesting line of work, where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota.
Oh.
Lived there till I was 18, went to school in Chicago, and then got a scholarship to study overseas, went to England, and kind of never looked back. I lived in England for a while freelancing, then Southeast Asia, then Hong Kong, and then China twice.
Got your master's degree in...
Got my master's degree in England in international relations and development studies.
Oh, sounds fairly appropriate.
It's been useful.
So growing up in the United States, did you think, I just definitely want to be a foreign correspondent? I want to go to Africa and Asia and cover the world?
Well, I think from as early as when I could read, and possibly even before that, I knew I wanted to do something that involved telling stories.
Oh.
And writing, once I started writing. But how I was going to do that, I hadn't quite figured out yet. And then as I got a little older, I heard about this thing called journalism, realized that you could, constantly learn, meet really interesting people, travel, write, and, have something new happen every day. And that sounded like a pretty good fit.
Did you, growing up, have any folks that you paid attention to, Walter Cronkite types or others that you said, that could be me in 30 years?
I don't think there was one specific person when I was a kid, but one person who did indirectly have some impact on me was my uncle, who was in the Vietnam War in 68, 69. And as a little kid, knowing that I had an uncle over there, I paid more attention to the coverage of the Vietnam War than I might have otherwise. And once I was in high school and college, I paid a lot of attention to why we got into the war, why it went the way it did, what Vietnam was like as a country, and I became increasingly interested in what Vietnam was like as a country now that there wasn't a war, which is part of what took me to Southeast Asia and made me decide to be based there as a freelancer.
Wow. How did you make that happen? Did you apply, filled out an application, and...
No, it was much harder than that. I had done some freelancing in Africa. I'd gone to Ethiopia and the Western Sahara, and so I had some clips. I'd done my undergraduate degree in journalism, and I'd done various part-time jobs in journalism before, going right back to high school when I was a sports writer for the local suburban newspaper. But so I had some relevant clips to show newspapers, and I said I want to go and set up in Southeast Asia, and you can pay me per story, and what do you think? And initially there was some wariness. Well, we can take a chance and see what you come up with, but no promises yet. But then I met this photographer who had been active in Vietnam during the war, Tim Page, and he sort of took me under his wing, gave me a lot of good advice, introduced me to David Greenway at the Boston Globe, who at the time was a senior editor. He'd been a former Vietnam War correspondent, and he kind of knew how this went, young people wanting to work their way into being foreign correspondents, and he thought this was a fine thing to try to do. So he said, okay, we'll give you a letter to get you accredited in Thailand so that you can get your visa, your residence permit to live there. And let's see how it goes, and we'll take stories from you. So it started with that.
Is that typically how people get paid? It's by the story? It's as a consultant, essentially? Or
there are two different models. And in fact, when I was in journalism school, one of my professors noticed that I was particularly interested in international news and said, okay, so how are you thinking of doing this? And I said, I have no idea. How should I be thinking about doing it? And he said, okay, two possible routes. One is that you get a job with a good small to medium-sized paper, work your way up, prove yourself, eventually get onto a larger paper, a paper that's large enough to have foreign bureaus, and then, kind of play internal politics well enough that you get one of those bureaus. Or you could just go. Pick a place that is interesting enough to editors and to readers that they want to have someone there reporting on it, but not so interesting that they already have someone there. And then you prove yourself and you can work your way into a job. But many people choose the first route. Many people, prefer to have the security. I mean, it is risky to go out with a couple of suitcases and a laptop and and just sort of try to make your way. But at least back then it did work. It could work.
And you made it work. You went to China and opened up the China Bureau?
Well, then I was a full-time correspondent. When I went to Southeast Asia, I was freelance.
Oh, okay.
So I very quickly I became the regular contributor or the stringer for the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, CBC in Canada, and NPR. And then NPR offered me a full-time gig and then moved me first to Hong Kong and then to China.
It just seems so enormous to open the China Bureau.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was exciting.
Yeah.
And, China remains, I think, one of the most interesting, exciting stories on earth that you can cover without getting shot at.
That's an important last part of that sentence.
Yes. But also, even without the last part of the sentence, I think it's one of the most interesting stories anywhere.
Yeah.
And I think 100, 200 years from now, when we look back at this time in history, China's rise will be one of the most important things that happened.
China's rise and our ability to open up, President Nixon opening the doors, I guess made that possible for folks to go over and develop relationships, and including business relationships.
Well, that was a first small step, and that certainly did help. The Chinese government wanted to see the U.S. also back away from Taiwan, not recognize Taiwan as being China.
A legitimate entity in it.
The legitimate entity that got seated at the UN. So once that switched over to the People's Republic of China, there was a lot more opening up. But I think what really made the difference was, Mao Zedong really wasn't that interested in opening up China. He saw that it was to China's benefit to have a relationship with the U.S. to balance off against the Soviet Union at the time, which China had fairly tense relations with at the time.
Right.
Once Deng Xiaoping became the premier leader in the late 70s, he said, we need to open up. And we need to be going about development in a very different way than what we had done up until this point. If you look at Mao's record, some 30 to 40 million Chinese died prematurely because of political policies. So Deng, who had worked very closely with Mao and had been responsible for some of those deaths, but also did not agree with Mao on what to do with the economy, said, okay, we need to be more pragmatic. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white. If it catches mice, it's a good cat. It doesn't matter if our market is moving toward being a free market or is strictly a communist market. If it works for the people, it's a good market. So that's really when things changed.
So that was a population or a people-oriented attitude. We have an unbelievably large population. Many of them are impoverished. What can we do to deal with that?
Yeah, and also, all of these 3 decades of communism with Maoist characteristics didn't really work so well for us, did they? The economy contracted. Public health indicators improved somewhat because of the barefoot doctors going out to villages that previously didn't have any medical care. But in terms of, trying to use the Great Leap Forward to, have people melt steel in their backyards to make to contribute to China's steel industry, it was just a waste of energy. And Deng looked at all that and said, this is nuts. Let's actually unleash the potential that China has within its own people. This is a population of entrepreneurs. These are people with incredible energy. And let's just let them use it, get out of the way a little bit more.
Was there a base to do that within China, or was it always understood we have to develop trading partners overseas and work with all the other developing and developed countries?
Right. So very interesting question, because if you look at another country that was and still to some degree is, very strictly communist, North Korea has something called the Juche idea, self-reliance. We can do it all ourselves, which of course they never could. They were able to continue to function reasonably well up until the 1990s because they were getting help from first the Soviet Union and then Russia, although once the Soviet Union collapsed, so did their aid. And then they started having problems. China always knew that it needed to have interactions with other countries, trade with other countries, bringing in ideas from other countries. The one time when China was more close to that was under Mao. So under Deng, it sort of reverted to norm. If you think back to, the time of the Silk Road in, 6th century, 8th century, 9th century, China was bringing in ideas from all over, from Europe, from the Middle East, from Africa, and it was a very cosmopolitan center. And it really thrived because of it, economically, but also culturally, philosophically. And so I think there's some recognition within China today that being open is actually good for China.
How does the political establishment there handle being open with, again, so much poverty and so much agitation and young people saying we want more freedoms?
There's a lot less poverty than there used to be in China. While there are still about 100, the numbers vary depending on what level you're using to define poverty, but 100 to 150 million people beneath the poverty line out of a population of 1.3 billion. It's a lower percentage than in the United States that are below the poverty line.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and the vast majority of people get through high school now, or at least get through junior high school. There are more economic opportunities. When I've gone to villages, even the poorest villages in China, most people will say, our lives now are hard, or still, there are certainly areas that could be improved upon. But if we compare what we have now with what we had 20 years ago, there's no comparison. Now we might be eating, a simple meal 3 times a day, but 20 years ago we were eating what the pigs ate.
That sounds like an enormous change in, frankly, a very short amount of time. We keep hearing sort of stereotypes of the large cities, both huge teeming populations and incredible pollution and smog, but we may have a stereotypical view of that may not be the same as what's actually going on.
Well, and I think myself and my colleagues might be partially responsible for that because, of course, we write about the real, sort of smog crises when they happen, but they don't happen every day.
Yeah.
There was a terrible one in early this year. There was a terrible one in January 2013 that it lasted for about 5 days, and it was just off the charts bad. It was 40 times the level of smog that the UN, the World Health Organization, says that people should ever be exposed to. And it was the sort of smog where you could feel it in your eyes, you could feel your chest tighten. I just sort of stayed inside and tried to breathe shallowly, but that's not how life normally is in Beijing.
Yeah, okay. We're going to take a break right now. When we come back, lots more to talk about.
Hi, I'm Santa Clara County Supervisor Dave Cortese, and one of the things that people ask me all the time is, how can I get involved? How can I make a difference? I have people contact me, constituents, who say, I'm ready to be involved more with my community. What do you recommend? Well, one of the things I would recommend is getting involved with the local Democratic Party. It's not only something that you can and should do as a Democrat, but it can be something very inspiring. This is the party that stands up for people most in need, and they can certainly use your help. As an elected official, I know that. As a Democratic activist in my own right, I know that you can make a difference by being involved on a day-to-day basis with our local Democratic Party. Want to know how to contact them? Do it by phone, 408-445-9500, or go to their website, www.sccdp.org. Your local Democratic Party, a great place to get involved.
Welcome back to Democratic Television and our guest, Mary Kay Magistad, a fascinating person who's been all over the world. You haven't just covered China. You've been in Southeast Asia. You've been in Africa. How do you get signals for what you should be covering? Is that something that you choose, or do you get a memo in the morning? Or
Almost all the stories, the story ideas come from me. And that's been true with everyone I've worked for over time. But, you know, I mean, there are stories where it's pretty clear you should be there. And I will talk to my editors and say, look, this is going on. I think it's worth us being there. Occasionally they'll call me and say, you know, we'd like you to go to this place. So, yeah, it just depends. But I read widely. I talk to people all the time. I try to, you know, connect things that are going on in the place where I'm based with what might be going on elsewhere. When it comes to China, China's impact on the world is just so extraordinary that you could go anywhere. In fact, I did a trip to Micronesia, and there were significant China stories to do in Guam and Palau and Saipan. Really interesting ones. You just wouldn't necessarily expect that to be a trove of China stories.
so you get to determine what you're going to look into, sort of based on what might be going on around the world or in America. Because are you conscious that you're speaking to an American audience, or is your audience larger than that?
No, for the program The World, the audience is in the United States. Occasionally, because we're a BBC co-production, the BBC World Service will pick up some of the stories, and occasionally they will actually put together a whole show. They have a show now called Boston Calling, which takes some of the best of the stories from the world, and it's a once-a-week show that they'll put out on the World Service.
So you are in China quite a bit, or have been, and so you
Lived in China for 14 years.
That's my point. A long
Yeah.
time. You're hearing from Chinese people asking you questions as an American. So what's going on with those crazy Americans?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, for years, certainly under the Bush administration, when I'd get into a cab, and I always sit in the front seat so I can talk to the cab driver, it would be, oh, you're an American, you know, what are you guys doing in Iraq? You know, why are you guys, you know, always starting wars? That's over now. Now the comments are different. And occasionally, also it's a different generation of cab drivers. They're younger, they're a little more hip, some of them are even a little better traveled. But they certainly watch the news and are aware of what's going on in the States. And so it's sometimes, why can't your Congress get it together? But overall, general admiration for the United States.
A lot of Chinese young people are coming here to study and taking advantage of what I think is a great educational system. Do they talk about things like, boy, you know, my cousin so-and-so was there, really came away loving the country, learning a lot, starting his own or her own company?
Part of that, yes. I think, you know, I talk to a lot of people who have relatives here. I think increasingly young Chinese parents realize the importance of their children learning critical thinking and creative thinking, and they feel that they're not going to get it in the Chinese school system, which tends to teach by rote and not really allow people to explore other ways of thinking about, you know, particular problems or issues, which is in keeping with the general political system in China. I think the feelings of Chinese friends and acquaintances of mine about the United States are quite mixed. There's admiration about what the United States has achieved. Some of them feel as Chinese being here that there's a certain amount of distortion in the media of what actually happens in China, of what life is like in China. There's some feeling that there's a certain amount of discrimination, but not too much. And also, I think it's bewildering sometimes, both for Chinese and Indian friends of mine, when they come to American suburbs in particular, and it's just so quiet. It's like, where are all the people? You walk out on a street in Bombay or Beijing or Shanghai, Delhi, and it's just a cacophony. You know, you run into thousands of people before you've walked 10 minutes, and that's what you're used to. And actually for me, as a recovering foreign correspondent being back after living in Asian cities for 25 years, that's one of the strangest things for me is, you know, I'm in a city, I'm in one of the most vibrant cities in the United States, and it just feels so quiet. beneath the surface, there's a lot going on there, a lot of really interesting people doing cutting edge things.
Right.
But you don't get that same buzz the second you walk out your door.
Yeah. So why are you in the United States now? You're recovering, you're taking a break.
I'm writing a
now?
book, a China-related book, and then I'll be reporting again. I mean, this is a vocation. It's what I intend to do the rest of my life.
What are the others, folks like you, like? Do you have a network? You guys hang out together, or is it kind of a you're on your own line of work?
Yeah, no, I think foreign correspondents tend to have a pretty tight community. I mean, obviously we have other friends as well, both who are from the countries where we live and who are in other lines of work. But I think being a journalist in general and a foreign correspondent in particular draws a certain kind of person, someone who's very curious, very open-minded, fairly adventurous. And because we're all going off in different directions, covering different stories, but we might loop back and do the story someone else was doing at some point in the future, it's great to be able to talk to each other and say, well, what was that like? What did you learn there? Who should I talk to? But also just to share stories. I mean, we all love stories.
Yeah.
So
the thing that got you into this in the first place.
It's great to get together and have a beer and just hear what the other person's thinking and what they've been doing and what stories they have to tell.
What do you see as the biggest story that you've covered? What's something that's had a huge impact on you?
I think the
Because
story...
I know you've covered some really tragic situations and huge losses of life.
Sure. When I was based in Southeast Asia, I spent a lot of time covering Cambodia. The aftermath of the Khmer Rouge era there, the Vietnamese occupation, the UN peacekeeping operation, the ongoing civil war. But I would say that the story that had the biggest impact on me emotionally and personally was covering the aftermath of genocide in Rwanda. I mean, it was just an extraordinary thing to wrap your mind around, that in the course of 3 months, 800,000 people could be hacked to death by their neighbors and sometimes by their relatives, and that a government could somehow move people to do that. And so it was challenging both in terms of recognizing what the worst of human nature can do, and also in talking to survivors, really being inspired by their resilience and their ability to keep going. At least many of them were able to keep going.
So what do you feel that your responsibility is in a circumstance like that? To cover it in the back of your mind, are you thinking, is there anything I can do to affect this crisis?
Well, I think by being a witness and by being able, trying to be as honest a witness as possible in understanding what happened here, why did it happen, what are the consequences. That's already doing something. There had been one situation, and different people come down differently on these issues. There had been one situation where I was in a refugee camp and someone was being chased and attacked by others in the refugee camp. He'd already been hacked with a machete. And I pulled him aside and took him to a clinic that was nearby, because he would have been killed there otherwise. Wow. And some journalists say, no, I must always stay at a distance and just observe. I think at some point you have to be a human being as well. I don't think that interferes with the integrity of the story. In fact, I did tell a reporter's notebook story on that, and it was basically on the tension within the camps. So everyone makes their own ethical decisions. That was one of mine.
Wow. What are the takeaways you have learned there from, here's China and the political system? And I know this is like way too large a question. Then you come home and see, Congress not doing well, the Tea Party trying to shut down the country, and in some ways being successful. Do you see parallels, or is that too much of a stretch to say governments can really be?
Well, I would say that not so much with the Tea Party itself, because with that, I've talked to Chinese officials and think tank people who are like, and you guys think democracy is a better system? Seriously? But when it comes to the recent revelations about the NSA and surveillance of Americans. You know, I find myself thinking, oh, I've been living with this in China for, these past 14 years, but I didn't expect I'd be coming home and dealing with the same level of surveillance. And I think within China, there were different levels of reaction. I mean, at the official level, it was like, well, of course, we always knew this was happening. But I think ordinary Chinese citizens were kind of dismayed. You know,
Yeah.
we thought you guys were better than that.
Do you speak different forms of Chinese?
Not different forms. I speak Mandarin.
Mandarin.
Imperfectly, but, you know, I can
You're
hold
able
a
to have a
conversation. Yeah.
conversation and feel
Yeah.
comfortable in reading your notes and going over, oh, I just learned this.
Yeah.
Did you study? Did you take classes, or was it just on the road?
So I had been in Southeast Asia before I went to China. I persuaded NPR to let me set up the China Bureau, and I did not at that point speak any Chinese. So they said, great, you can have a summer to learn Chinese.
Oh,
Now, the State Department, which normally gives its diplomats 6 months to learn French or most other languages, gives them 2 years to learn Chinese.
Oh.
Full-time, 8 hours a day. So I learned as much as I could
wow.
in a summer, and then just kept learning on my own.
Well, Mary Kay, we have about a minute left. Is there some way that people can be in touch with you or follow your writings or musings?
Sure. Well, two things. The website pri.org has all my previous stories over the past decade on it, from the program The World. And then also, just for my own amusement and self-therapy, I now have a blog called recoveringforeigncorrespondent.com, where I'm writing about being back in the States, but also about some issues related to China and to being a journalist in general.
Wow, sounds great. Well, thank you very much for being on Democratic Television.
You're welcome. It was fun.
Good. Thanks for watching DTV. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or go to our website, www.sccdp.org. Thanks a lot, and please help make a difference.